Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. This time I'm going to surprise many of you because for the first time in 20 years I've purchased an Apple computer. Specifically, I've got this, an iPad A16, which is going to replace this rather old Samsung Android tablet. But why have I switched to Apple? Well, let's first take a closer look at this, and then I'll explain. Right, here we have my lovely new iPad, which is a 2025 model with an A16 processor. Like the more expensive current models with an M3 or M5 processor, it has an 11-inch display, and it's available in versions with 128, 256 or 512 gigabytes of storage, and with either Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi and cellular connectivity. What we have here is the 128 gigabyte Wi-Fi model, which cost me £309.97 from Amazon UK. Meanwhile, in the US, the list price from Apple is $349, although some retailers are charging closer to $300. So clearly an iPad does remain an expensive product which costs considerably more than many Android tablets. However, the Apple price premium is not as great as it once was. So let's open it up, and to do this we don't have to trouble standing the knife, because if we just turn this over like that, we see on the back there are some pull tabs. So in theory I just will pull the pull tabs, something like that and like that, and in theory it now opens. I can never open anything, can I? But in theory, whoa, I've got in. Thank you, Floor, for catching that. And here is the tablet. There we are. And oh look, this is exciting. We just peel that back and we can see an apple. Let's get it out. Rustle, rustle, and all that. How does it come out? There we are. And as you can see, I've got the blue version. You can get these in various colours. There's a pink, there's a yellow, there's just a silver. I've got the blue version. And just to take a look at the packaging, we've also got here, this looks like some kind of documentation, iPad stuff, as we can see. And we also get in the box, the only other thing we get is a USB-C lead. So let's return to the tablet itself and go through its specifications. And as already mentioned, the system on a chip is an Apple A16, which has got a 5-core CPU and a 4-core GPU. And we also have here 6 gigabytes of RAM and 128 gigabytes of onboard flash storage. The display is Apple's Liquid Retina IPS with a resolution of 2360 by 1640, and I'll say more about the screen later in the video. The tablet has a one-piece aluminium body or aluminum body, depending on how you pronounce that word, which is beautiful. It's got a great build quality, and the whole thing weighs 477 grams. We have a 12 megapixel camera on the front for landscape orientation kind of working, FaceTime, things like that. And on the rear, we have got another camera, also 12 megapixel. And this camera supports 4K video recording at up to 60 frames a second. If we take a look at the edges, let's start with the short edges like that. On the left short edge, we have speaker grills and a power button. And this is also known as the Touch ID button because it includes a fingerprint scanner. On the right short edge, we then have more speaker grills, always good to have holes to let the noise out from the speakers, and in the middle, as we can see, we've got a USB-C connector, and this is for charging and connecting peripherals. Although sadly, whilst it does provide video output via DisplayPort or HDMI with the right adapter, the data connectivity is only USB 2.0, which is very poor indeed on a computer at this price point. Finally, on the bottom lung edge, we have a smart connector here in the middle for things like the keyboard, whilst on the top lung edge there are some extremely exciting volume controls. And so there we are, the iPad A16 Plus. And because it's an iPad, there's no 3.5mm audio jack and there's no microSD card slot. However, in computing, when you get new hardware, you almost always have to lose to win. And I hope that for me, here, the benefits will outweigh the omissions. Greetings! I've now got the iPad up and running, and right now it's running iOS 18, and I've installed the latest 18.7.3 update, which contains critical security fixes. There's also the option to upgrade to iOS 26, which is the version after 18, as Apple changed the numbering. However, this still has mixed reviews and some reports of problems after an upgrade, so I'm going to hold off upgrading for a little while, although I'm sure I'll get there in the end. And so, for now, the big question is, why have I switched to an iPad? Well, to explain, let's go across to my retiring Android tablet. And this is a Samsung Galaxy Note Pro 12.2, also known as the SMP900, that I purchased in 2014. And this is one of the best computers I've ever owned and has largely been used for running Google Docs. I used it for some of the writing and a lot of the editing and proofing on my last 3 books. And for about a decade, when recording YouTube videos, I've had my scripts and other technical notes on this tablet. So, for example, when recording pieces to camera, it's always been down at my side. And when shooting an SBC or other piece of hardware, it's always been just out of shot, containing a script or technical notes that have always evolved during the shoot. And when making Linux or other software videos, I've had the Samsung with my script or notes on it just under the monitor. So, as you can see, this has been a critical piece of production equipment that served me well for over 500 Explaining Computers videos. However, all good things come to an end, and this tablet now has some screen issues as well as a battery life under 15 minutes. And it still runs Android 4.4, which means that YouTube and many other apps haven't worked for some time. We've run up YouTube here, you'll see. We can't run it because it's not supported now on this tablet. It says you must upgrade. You can't upgrade because it's too old. And in fact, for a couple of years, it's not even been possible on this tablet to open a new Google Doc. So I've had to create each new script file by taking a copy of an older Docs file. So, okay, by now you probably think I've been absolutely crazy for keeping this tablet running for so long. But the reason I have is very simple, and I can demonstrate it very simply by going to Google Docs like that and bringing up the on-screen keyboard. And this is not, as some of you will realise, the standard Android on-screen keyboard. Rather, it's a custom keyboard created by Samsung for its original larger Android tablets. And as we can see, it's got a full number row, all standard punctuation keys, all 4 cursor keys, and even a control key that allows the use of the keystrokes Ctrl A, X, C and V for copying, pasting, etc. And for me, this on-screen keyboard was the key feature of this tablet. Sadly, when I started looking for a replacement for this tablet several years ago, I discovered that while Samsung devices still have a custom Android keyboard, it no longer has all of the basic keys. So, for example, this is the keyboard on a Samsung Galaxy Tab A11 Plus, where the single quote or apostrophe key is missing, as are the question mark key and a permanent tab key. And if we look to the standard Google Gboard Android keyboard, things are even worse. At least for me, the problem is that since the mid-2010s, it's become less common to use an on-screen keyboard on an Android tablet for text-based productivity, and so keyboards have principally been designed for phones. There are many third-party keyboards available, including CleverType, FlexKey, FlorisBoard, SwiftKey, and Typewise. But all of these are phone-centric and do not include what I consider to be very basic QWERTY keys. The only good alternative I found was the Hacker's keyboard, which was fantastic, and I would gladly have used on a new Android tablet. But sadly, the Hacker's keyboard is no longer supported in the latest versions of Android. And so hopefully, with all this explained, you now understand why I've stayed with this device for so long with its fantastic on-screen keyboard. So let's now return to the iPad, and if I bring up Google Docs and tap to edit, hey presto, we have the best on-screen keyboard that I can currently find on any Android or iOS device. Specifically, we have a large block of punctuation keys, including the single quote or apostrophe key and the question mark key, as well as a permanent tab key. What's more, all available characters are constantly available on a key or shift, including all forms of brackets, so we never have to go to another keybank. Now, I'm sure some iPad users are saying, Chris, that's not the standard iPad keyboard, and it most certainly isn't. And indeed, if I do this, we see the standard iPad keyboard, which in my view is very poor as it can't even be configured to include a number row and has almost no punctuation directly available. And so it requires constant bank switching, just like Google's Gboard. So the keyboard I'm using on an iPad is actually this one from Typefinity, which is a paid app and costs £4.99 or equivalent as a one-off purchase. If we take a look across at the Typefinity website, here it is, we can see here it explains the stock iOS keyboard was designed for a small screen, and on a tablet, numbers, cursor keys, punctuation and more should be right where you expect them. And on the Affinity keyboard, as we've seen here in Google Docs, they absolutely are. We've got all the keys available. And so the most fundamental reason I switched from an Android tablet to an iPad was to use the Typefinity on-screen keyboard, as I think it's the best one available for any Android or iOS device. And yes, I really wish Typefinity was available for Android. Oh, and before somebody asks in the comments, I am aware that there are very good on-screen keyboards on Windows tablets, and indeed I use one on a Surface 6 Pro that still runs Windows 10. But this will not last forever, and I wanted my new tablet to be a much lighter device, as I expect to use it a lot when travelling. In addition to Typefinity, I've installed the Chrome and Firefox browsers, which make it easier to access multiple Google and other accounts and to keep them isolated from the operating system. For example, if you've got the Google Docs app installed, you can't access the desktop version in the included Safari browser using the same Google account. But here in Firefox, I can do just that, which makes it much easier to work across multiple documents. So, for example, if you want to have multiple documents open and cut and paste between them, it's easier to do that in the desktop application. As we can see, I've also got the desktop client for Gmail working here in the browser, as well as a desktop client for Microsoft Mail, and on this size of screen, I do prefer the desktop client to the cut-down app versions. In addition to the Typefinity keyboard, other factors that persuaded me to get an iPad included build quality as well as battery life, which I've found to be about 8 hours, although this may drop when I upgrade to iOS 26. And the iPad screen aspect ratio of roughly 16:11 is also better for writing with an on-screen keyboard than comparable Android tablets, which tend to be either 16:10 or 16:9. On the negative side, I've found that YubiKey security keys do not work, which for me is a major problem. But fortunately, Google Titan keys do work, although if I hadn't had both, it wouldn't have been possible to log in to my Google accounts, which are all in the Advanced Protection program. Finally, in terms of other downsides, whilst the iPad has decent cameras, I find it bizarre that photos and video files are stored in an isolated file space and do not appear in the file manager. And I also found you need to be very careful indeed to stop photos and other content being uploaded to iCloud. Certainly, there are many things you need to turn off in iOS to maintain security and privacy. In this context, it should be noted that you don't have to use an Apple account to set up or use an iPad. However, an Apple account is required to use the App Store, and so in practice you do have to use an Apple account, just as you have to use a Google account on an Android device. So there we are. I've become an iPad user. And with the Typefinity keyboard installed, there it is, it's working very well for my particular requirements. And it's also been very interesting delving more deeply than I have in the past into iOS. Although do not fear, if you're a regular viewer of this channel, we'll be back to Linux and indeed Windows in future videos. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.